Welcome to this tribute to Richard Toop. I'm Rachel Campbell. I was a friend of Richard's for about 25 years and his student in musicology, and like many people here, I think, also in music history. He then had me teaching in his classes, so we then worked together, and now I teach some classes here at the Conservatorium that he used to teach, that is to say the music history of the 20th and 21st centuries. So thanks to Richard, in no small part, because he was training me through that. I have the extremely satisfying vocation of attempting to turn people onto the amazing music of that period. Tonight's tribute is presented and organised by myself and some of Richard's friends, some of his other friends. It's been supported by the Conservatorium, and I'd especially like to thank Professor Anna Reid, the Dean, and the Deputy Dean, Matthew Heinsohn, as well as the venues manager, Guy McEwen. And it's notable, I think, that Anna and Guy were both taught by Richard. Anna, in fact, told me a wonderful anecdote about being in Richard's classes where he would pull out the Stockhausen scores and light up a cigar, at which point the rest of the class lit up as well. Richard said that he didn't want a funeral. He said to his daughter Samantha that he didn't want people standing around feeling sad. And Samantha, who's here tonight with her husband Craig, respected that, and Sam and some of Richard's other friends, we felt that we would like to make a public tribute to him. So I hope that this will be a celebration and a tribute, and to at least partly take Richard's wishes of not feeling too sad. It's obviously inevitable. He was one of my greatest friends through my whole life, and I'm sure that there are many others who feel that way as well. So sadness is appropriate perhaps a little bit in that sense, and also I suppose the sadness at the loss of one of the most significant minds in music of the last few decades. But what I hope happens tonight is that despite the inevitable sadness, that we'll celebrate what Richard has meant to us and also celebrate his achievements. So tonight will involve a number of people speaking and reminiscing, some performances by people who are Richard's friends, and I hope that through this we can evoke some of the main aspects of Richard's professional life as well as some of his personal qualities. And to that end, we'll hear from a range of people, so I'll introduce everybody in due course, but we have performers who we'll hear from, composers, an historian, an artist, an artistic administrator. But those of us who are speaking are very aware that Richard's interests and friendships were extremely wide, and much wider than we represent. In fact, Diane Collins, who's here, who I think was one of Richard's closest of all friends, would joke that he was a bit of a dark horse because we'd turn up in the few periods that he had in hospital, we'd turn up into his room and meet people there that we'd never heard of or heard him speak of. And when I said earlier that we played Xenakis' Metastasis because that was a work that was important to him, but as I think you all know, one of the things that people remarked on and were so impressed by Richard was the sheer breadth of his knowledge, particularly in relation to music, but also in other things. And there were literally 1,000 things we could have played that I think he himself would have been delighted to hear. So Xenakis' Metastasis it was, but many other things would have been possible. So I don't want to forget, even though it's just us talking, the sheer breadth and plurality of his knowledge and interests and his friendships. Since his preferred mode of socialising seemed mostly to be one-on-one or in small groups, many people knew him on an intimate level and probably felt some sense of closeness to him at times. So, to increase our scope, the final part of the evening we will ask if any of you, would like to speak for about a minute and perhaps share a memory you have of Richard's or pay tribute to him in one way or another. We will probably only have a small amount of time at that stage, so we'll probably ask you to keep them short, but have a think if there's anything that you'd like to share would be of interest. First of all, we have 2 videos to play. Last week in Melbourne, Richard Dunn, who's on stage here, who I'll introduce properly later, his partner Suzanne Davies runs the RMIT Gallery, and the Illusion Ensemble, who Richard Toop has been associated with over a long period of time, had a concert of premieres, and it was dedicated to Richard. Two people were involved in that concert in particular who had had very long associations with Richard, and they recorded videos for us to play now. The first of those is Darryl Buckley, who's the artistic director of the Illusion Ensemble, and as well as a virtuoso guitarist. And Darryl's place in the history of Australian music has been an important one because he's commissioned so many works and had the ensemble perform so many pieces. Secondly, we'll hear from Richard Barrett, the Welsh composer, whose music is well known, very, very well known internationally. And Richard Toop was a long-standing champion of Barrett's work. We've got quite a lot of Richards this evening. So if we can turn to those videos, they're just very short, a couple of minutes each.
I was hoping to begin these few words with an account of how and where Richard and I first met. But try as I may, I just can't put my finger on it. It must have been in London sometime in the mid-1980s, but I suppose the main reason for my not knowing is that through his writings and through our shared enthusiasm in particular for the music of Stockhausen, he seemed always to have been around in my awareness. I remember in particular reading his reports in Contact magazine on various music festivals and being struck by his ability to identify so readily the central point of interest or the central flaw in a piece of music, and to express that with a wit and wisdom which are no doubt familiar to everyone in this room. What always impressed me most was that the same wit and wisdom would always shine through even his most analytical writings, so that whether he was writing about something that I had never come across before, or something very familiar to me, his words would have the effect of making me want immediately to listen to the music in question, from the new and wider perspective that he had opened. And the discipline of musicology can surely aim at nothing higher than this. As time went by, Richard wrote just as perceptively about my own work too, and we were discussing only 3 or 4 years ago his further plans to do so. No doubt he contributed at least as much as anyone else to whatever knowledge and understanding there is of the music I've written, for which I will always be grateful. But I will always be far more grateful for his constant enthusiasm and encouragement on a personal level for more than 30 years. If I've remained optimistic about the importance and future of our music to the present day and beyond, a principal reason for this was that he always did, and from a position of knowledge rather than of ignorance.
In the Australian new music environment, Richard Toop was an extremely rare being. He was a man of ideas, he was incredibly articulate, and he was able to tease out some of the most arcane ideas and thinking of composers, if you like, and bring them to the public's attention in a way that was persuasive, articulate, and full of warmth, if you like, and enthusiasm for his subject. Richard Toop charted many of the significant milestones in the life of the Illusion Ensemble. It begins with our very first concerts in Melbourne in the early 1990s. I believe the very first Illusion concert that Richard attended was when the composer Richard Barrett came to Australia for the premiere of Another Heavenly Day. Richard also covered our 10th anniversary concert in Sydney, and I brought him up to Brisbane in 2001 when we performed the significant cycle of Richard Barrett, Dark Matter. It was a really beautiful interview and discussion that he gave with Keith Galash of Real Time and Richard Barrett, composer, who was again present in Australia. I remember Richard Toop very, very fondly. I remember him, and it's worth repeating, I remember him as a man of ideas and somebody who will be sorely missed.
The first performance that we have tonight is from Scott, Davie and Taryn Fiebig. Scott was a close friend of Richard's. You may know him as a Rachmaninoff specialist and soloist with the SSO and other ensembles. And I think most of us have heard of Taryn. So, Scott, what are you going to play, please, and why did you choose to play this at Richard's tribute or celebration?
Thank you, Rachel. Richard, as you said, had very wide tastes, and he certainly had a great love of music from the 19th century. Over the past year and a half or so, Taryn and I were hoping to record some music for the ABC. It was perpetually delayed, but I was really happy that only a couple of months ago I was able to give Richard a recording of the music that we had made together. He particularly liked these two songs by Brahms, so we're going to sing these two songs, Von ewiger Liebe, or Of Eternal Love, and Mainacht, or May Night, both Opus 43, published in 1869. I could tell you a lot about the songs, but I think it probably suffices to say that they're both love songs, and Richard knew them intimately. Thank you.
like to introduce the panel now, the other speakers. Firstly, Diane Collins was an associate professor of history and taught history at the Conservatorium for well over a decade.
Well over two.
Well over two. It all blurs. She also wrote a book on the history of the Conservatorium, which, by the way, I think is the best account of classical music life in Australia in the first half of the 20th century. And she's one of Richard's absolutely closest friends. So Diane will speak about Richard from a fairly personal level, I think. Emeritus Professor Richard Dunn, the artist, was also a long-time friend of Richard's, partly through Richard Toop's close friendship with Richard's partner, Suzanne Davies. Those of us who were close to Richard Toop in his last few years owe Richard Dunn and Suzanne, but Richard was in Sydney, a great debt of gratitude. I don't know how incorrigibly bohemian your understanding of Richard Toop was. I think that was a very essential part of his character. And in the last few years, when that combined with illness, it was an adventurous time indeed, and interesting anyway. Many of us, David Larkin, Diane, Moya Henderson, a bunch of other people made ad hoc efforts to sort of help Richard out in some of these, when these things were combining in an unhappy fashion. But Richard Dunn suddenly turned up and just fixed everything. And so I think Richard Toop had a much easier time of it in the last few years, thanks to Richard and Suzanne. Michael Smetanin and Damien Ricketson, both composers whose work has been performed here and internationally, and they were both taught by Richard. They're both also now composition lecturers at the Conservatorium. And Laura Chislett has just joined us, the legendary new music flautist. My friend Tonya, who's going to play later, and I both well remember the halcyon days of Sydney Alpha. It's a terrible joining of new music ensembles names. But remember the days of Sydney Alpha as Laura would work her way along in these incredibly virtuosic pieces along long lines of music stands. And we may get some of that tonight. Laura's going to play the next piece. I'll ask you about that in a minute. But I actually want to take the chair's prerogative and start with my reflections on Richard Toop. My first instinct when I started to think about what I wanted to say was that I should outline a brief biography. And I realised that since Richard died, there have been a lot of people who have said, including Darryl Buckley just now, that one of the things that was astounding about Richard was his ability to explain incredibly complicated musical, technical and aesthetic concepts with the most utmost clarity, that all of a sudden these things would be clear to you in ways they never had been before. And when he trained me as a musicologist, one of the things that he said was, you need to start by outlining the basics. What do we have here? So I think that that's where my instinct to sort of just outline, okay, so we all remember the basic facts of Richard's life came from. He was born in southern England, in Chichester, on the 1st of August 1945. He went to the local grammar school, which he didn't feel was a particularly distinguished education, except for he had a wonderful English teacher, he said, who introduced him to a lot of poetry, including, it's not the immediate thing you think of with Richard, but Gerald Manley Hopkins and other poets. He also had two aunts who used to take him to museums, art museums and science museums, and he said that it was that childhood engagement with the wondrous, the idea that there were these wonderful things out there in the world that you could go and enjoy and be part of. Actually, be part of is not a very Richard statement. I would say contemplate. You could contemplate and understand. So he felt that was how he gained his capacity for wonder. He learnt piano to a high level through school. He was listening to new music on the BBC, and then on the Crystal set, he was listening to continental radio in the 60s. He was also composing in the period that he was at school. He studied for an undergraduate degree at the University of Hull from 1964 to 1967. He felt some of his teachers were quite undistinguished, and the main exception was Dennis Arnold, the renowned Monteverdi specialist, and Richard enjoyed discussions with him about music, but also enjoyed shocking him with his latest indeterminate pieces. It was quite a surprise to me when he told me that he dressed stylishly in a cravat through these years, and it was not surprising to know he saw a lot of continental films. He enrolled in a PhD in 1967 to about 1970 on the beginnings of European indeterminacy, and worked as a watchman at an art gallery so he could sit there through the night and write. He didn't complete his PhD largely because of problematic supervision, but I think also a lack of pressure in comparison to the current context. He was a new music pianist in London and performed such pieces as Lamont Young's compositions 1960 pieces. For example, he told me he performed the Draw a Line and Follow It piece. He performed Cage's Concert for Piano and Orchestra, and he's actually will go down in history on a very wide level for having been given the first solo performance of Satie's Vexations, which is the piece in which a passage of music is repeated 840 times and which lasted 24 hours. I've got a picture of Richard doing this later. Some of you may have already seen that. His first article was in 1968, so we're calling it Toopus Opus 1, in Circuit magazine. He became Stockhausen's teaching assistant and taught analysis classes in the Hochschule in Köln. Notable students there included Moya Henderson, Kevin Volans, Walter Zimmermann, for example, Claude Vivier. He fell out with Stockhausen, which apparently pretty much everybody did, and in London, Roger Woodward told him about a job at the New South Wales State Conservatorium of Music, so Richard came here to Australia in 1975. Here, once he was at the Conservatorium, he taught in the high school, he taught tertiary classes, he taught composition at various points, and the wider Sydney public and the wider national public got to know him through talks on radio and also through various public talks. Richard, as most of us know, was also an enthusiastic polemicist, particularly, I believe, when he was here initially, and he seemed to take a delight in stirring up the local composers and the ABC. And some will regret Richard's influence here and the strong view of modernism that he espoused. I think he would see it, that criticism is essential to a strong culture. I imagine, I didn't speak about this with him, but I imagine that he would have felt that people could either defend their position or change their position. And if they defended their position convincingly, he would change his mind. So his salvos were in a spirit of debate, I think, rather than a spirit of stifling. I'm not sure if that's how everyone would remember it. I think it's important to refer to that because I think it is a part of Richard's life in Australia. From 1980 to 2001, he was head of musicology here at the Conservatorium, and his advocacy for musicology within the institution has been important, I think. He was a legend at faculty and university meetings. He would quote Goethe and other philosophers, but only when making a point, not just to be a wanker. One anecdote that he used to repeat to me every so often was that John Painter had apparently wanted to cut down the number of academic classes, especially for his cello students. And so within the meeting, Richard said, "I've not seen any evidence that the cellists are academically less capable than the others," and apparently won that round, or so he remembered it. I think that one of the most important and enduring aspects of Richard's life will be his academic articles, because he was really interested to explain composers' creative processes, and so he looked at sketch study, looking at the sketches that composers made and putting together how the actual process that they went through to make the work. So I just have a few of Richard's articles here. So I'll just get it on. So there's the first one. This is possibly the most historically significant because in this article he outlines the history of early serialism in a way that had not been accounted for before. And so this is an article that I've seen referenced in textbooks numerous times. So it's a really internationally significant one. This is one that he wrote a whole lot on Stockhausen, particularly on Stockhausen's early works. Particularly, there's a lot on the electronic works in particular. This is another article for which Richard was very, very well known. This is a tiny sample. The English pianist Ian Pace and I are probably going to put together a bibliography. I have, by the end of the year, to be published around the end of the year, it will be an incomplete bibliography because there's just such a lot that I probably won't be able to find in Richard's massive stuff. But this is the tip of the iceberg, but I think these are probably have been the most influential pieces of writing that he did. So the four facets of the new complexity, where he identified a phenomenon. He was wrongly blamed or wrongly admired for coining the term the new complexity, so he used to enjoy denying that. But this was really the sort of first substantial articulation of this movement in music. He edited with James Boros Ferneyhough's collected writings, probably not a hugely significant publication in terms of Richard's own writing, but Richard as an interviewer was a fascinating thing. We used to compare notes about interviewing, and Richard used to scare the composers quite seriously, where composers would often come out with very interesting and sort of important articulations of their ideas, whereas I would go in as, at that stage, a young blonde woman saying, "Really?" And I would get people opening up quite deep. So we had quite different styles in that respect. But so reading Richard's interviews is very interesting. His monograph on Ligeti, which Ligeti himself said really kind of got him. And this is his last major book, was 6 lectures. So from 2002 to about 2010, Richard gave lectures in the Stockhausen summer courses, and he was analysing the works and how they were written. So 6 of them ended up being perfected and written up in that there. Richard's liner notes are also a really major part of his production. I've already had people asking about whether there's going to be a collected writings of his liner notes, because his insights into pieces which may not have been written about in any other context were quite amazing, particularly as they were often written with composers, working with composers. I want to say just a couple of final things. On a personal level, Richard was, without a shadow of a doubt, my mentor, but I think that is a word that he would have utterly rejected. He probably would have turned his nose up if I'd said that he'd trained me as well. I never broached that kind of thing with him. When he died though, I found out, the composer Richard Barrett told me that at one point I'd gone to Berlin to interview Richard Barrett, and he'd had a sick child and an overdue commission, and so he was kind of not able to see me day after day. I had no idea, but Richard Toop was sending him emails saying, "You must see her, you must see her." So he would sort of support you without you knowing it. And I think that probably the way his attitude was that we were just having fun, as you would expect to do when you were discussing art and music, or South Park in Richard's case, or Pulp Fiction, or Game of Thrones, or whatever. And so I think that he would reject the idea that he was a scholar who was forming a school of people around him. I think that his basic ethos was that of hedonism. And as far as he was concerned, this was just an extremely good way to spend your time. I asked him once where he went on holidays, and of course he didn't, because what could be more fun than staying at home, writing about new music, playing computer games and watching DVDs? So I asked him if he'd been to America. He said, they've never asked. He really was only interested in going if someone flew him over for a keynote. And towards the end of his life, somebody was going to fly him over for a keynote at an Earl Brown conference, but unfortunately that didn't happen. He ended up delivering it by video, so that was something. And that is probably going to be his last publication. It's a book that's coming out about Earl Brown just at the moment, and Richard has a chapter in it. He was quite formal. He told me once that he'd never referred to the Conservatorium as the con. And I think Diane's going to speak about some of the contradictions of Richard. He identified as a loner. He identified with Kipling's Cat Who Walked by Himself. He identified with Kipling a bit too, actually. The English was there. But to me, he was, from what I saw, he was incredibly gregarious and incredibly warm. We used to go drinking into the very small hours around Sydney's bars for a long period, and people used to come up and talk to us all the time. I know that does happen in bars late at night, but I think that this happened a lot with us, and I think they were attracted to Richard's voice and his manner. So we ended up having a lot of fascinating interactions. The last thing I want to say is something I want to say concretely and publicly, which is that I have inherited Richard's scores and recordings. And I'm not entirely sure what I do with them. It will take some time to actually get a sense of what's there. But I hope that just as people went to Richard when they wanted to know more about a composer, I hope that the word will get around that people can come to me to get recordings off the radio, not illegally or anything, that people will be able to get recordings and scores that are really hard to source in other ways, because it is probably a unique collection in the world. So if you hear of anyone who needs anything, maybe don't ask me in the next 6 months, but at some point after that, I really hope to be able to give people access to that stuff. Okay. I want to hear now from Michael Smetanin, who, as I said, is an internationally renowned composer. His work's performed all over the place, and also now a lecturer here at the Conservatorium.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. Richard was a great friend of mine. He was also a fantastic friend of a lot of other people. He was a great mentor and an inspiration to many of us. One thing I wanted to say was that it's just shows how strong an influence he was, and I could say that he's the only person that I know or ever knew that I could actually call a gentleman. I mean, being gregarious, and he could actually be very, very, very cutting about somebody who he thought was producing, poor music, for instance. Let's just leave it at that. But one of the things that is really, really fantastic is that some of the first, or all of the first people that Richard touched and inspired are all here tonight. In the front row we have Gerard Brophy, Rick Formosa, Michael Barkle, and also Elena Kats-Chernin. And in those early days, starting in around about the late 70s, Richard touched us all and was really, really very, very important in particularly the years that followed when we left and when we graduated, because he led me. I still remember the night, Saturday night, we were at Richard's place. Rick Formosa and I were there, and that was the night, the first time I'd heard the music of Louis Andriessen to start. And of course there was plenty of wine and all that kind of thing. That was a key feature with Richard. It was wonderful. There was a joke that used to go around that you could tell the scores that Richard Toop had borrowed from the library, because there would always be the telltale red wine stains on a couple of pages. And also, the time that I went DUI in 1982 was when I was driving home from a lesson with Richard. So there you go. But it's wonderful that all of those first people that really Richard touched are here tonight, and thanks for being here. Richard didn't only touch those guys, our generation, my generation, Elena's, Jerry, Rick, Michael, but people like Damien here, or and Damien's generation, Matthew Slomowitz, for instance, was also inspired by Richard. There are many, 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 many others as well. But I think that from those late 70s times, Richard was a great counterweight to some of the trends that were happening in Australian music. That obviously Richard, being a card-carrying modernist, pretty well despised, I suppose you could say, and sometimes for perhaps good reason. So that's really what I want to say. I want to, if he was here, I'd give him a hug and say thank you very much, because my life wouldn't be the way it is now without Richard.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm so glad. It's amazing. The famous generation that Richard Toop taught, and you're all here, so it's really exciting. If we could hear from Damien, so on the theme of composers who Richard has taught.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Michael, also. I think I was in my second year as an undergraduate composition student when I trudged up to the fourth floor of the Con, which was then in Pitt Street, to have a composition lesson with a musicologist. And my memories are I had barely introduced myself to Richard when he hit me with this blast of Barrett, and then an immediate demand that I come up with 3 compositional strategies to handle that material. And that was the beginning of my sort of relationship with Richard. And he was a true mentor to me, both formally. He was a composition teacher for me in some of my undergrad years, and later also a PhD supervisor. But he was also a very informal mentor through much of my professional life as a composer, and also particularly in my role as an artistic director of a specialist new music group, Ensemble Offspring. There are several composers, including some in this room, who studied with Richard and have commented that their lessons went along the sometimes frustrating lines of, well, first the student presents Richard with their latest groundbreaking idea, from which Richard responds with something like, yes, that's very Darmstadt 1967. I guess Richard's perennial pointing out of who had been there and done it before you marked at least 2 qualities. First, he was just a complete encyclopedia of knowledge. In these days, or those days before you could ask Google or YouTube, you asked Toop. And his recommendations were always, relevant and high quality. And I have to say, when it came to programming with Ensemble Offspring, he was just like a walking repertoire bank. But the second, it's been there, done before remarks, was also his way of promoting a very outward-looking perspective in his students. Like, we were not going to be self-indulgent, navel-gazing composers. We had to engage with the world, the bigger world around us. I think another quality that was clearly evident in his prolific and insightful writings was his formidable mind. I mean, this could be a bit intimidating, as he was pretty quick to call out what he saw as intellectual laziness. And indeed, at one point in my doctoral program, he brutally took me down, reduced me to a complete mess, blew out my submission date by 6 months, but most importantly, vastly improved what I was doing. And I think Richard's demanding expectations of rigour were coupled with this real generosity and kindness of spirit. He always had time to share his vast knowledge, and he wanted students to succeed. And he would often back them up without them even asking, or sometimes without them even knowing. Like, I found out after the fact that Richard had vouched for me and Matthew Shlomowitz to Roger Woodward, that helped us land a gig in the then Sydney Spring Festival, which would subsequently mark the birth of Ensemble Offspring. He also recommended me also to the renowned Dutch composer Louis Andriessen, who I also would go on to study with. And only now do I hear, such as Rachel mentioned, other anecdotes of those who received sort of these quite selfless acts of support for which he sought no acknowledgement or gratitude. I guess that Richard's intellect and generosity was so respected is evident in the outpouring of tributes following his death, and not just in the sort of hardcore new music or musicology scenes. I found it quite moving, the stream of comments that flowed from the Cons notification of his death on its Facebook site. I mean, there were professionals and students of all walks, aesthetics, interests and endeavours, and I dare say there are very few people who can claim to have directly engaged the minds and impressed the minds of so many. Recently there was some research that suggests all of our musical tastes kind of freeze somewhere around when we turn 30, and Richard Toop was clearly not a subject in that study. I mean, Richard had this insatiable curiosity to stay abreast of what was going on around the world. He was always keen to hear the latest work from young composers and to be on the pulse of whatever the next generation was up to. And certainly as an artistic director of a new music group, if I wanted to know what interesting work was being produced by a younger generation in some far-flung corner of the globe, Richard was my man. He would just know this stuff. And he would know this because he was the very model of a sort of open and inquiring mind. About a year and a half ago, on the day of Ensemble Offspring's 20th birthday concert, I was about to make public that I was quitting the organisation in which I'd invested so much of my life and to which Richard had been so supportive, but he couldn't be there because of his ill health. And I don't really know why, but I found myself compelled to get up at 5 a.m. and through tears, it was a big moment in my life, I had to email him because I just needed him to know why I was doing this, and I needed him to know first. And I still don't really know why this was so important to me at the time, but I suffice to say, I think it says something about the impact and influence that he's played as a sort of significant figure, certainly in my life, as he clearly has done with so many others. So even today, when I'm composing and feeling unsure about some kind of composition, passage or decision, I sometimes still ask myself, what would Toopy think? Or what would he say? And although I can no longer enjoy that kind of direct, boozy critique, I still feel he's something of a guiding hand. So I certainly thank Richard for all he's given me, and may his forward-looking legacy continue. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Damien. I might just cycle through a couple of photographs here. Richard performing Satie's Vexations in 1967. Sam gave me a couple of photos, which I have up here. Here's Sam and Richard on the left there. That was certainly a surprise. I'd never seen Richard look anything like that. So young Richard. This is a fantastic photo. Don Banks, Richard Toop and Richard Meal. So we're not sure of the date. Apparently it's in the Don Banks file at the Australian Music Centre, so we'll know one day, but not today. And here's Richard with his very good friend Suzanne Davies, 1992. I'll leave it there. I've got some more later. But Laura Chislett is going to play a piece now. So, Laura, would you mind telling us why you chose this piece and what it is?
The piece is Backbone by Michael Smetanin.
And, well, I'm going to come at why I chose the piece in a bit of a roundabout way. First by saying that the flute doesn't have a lot of depth in its historic repertoire. And when I was in my early years at the con, Richard was not always complimentary about my repertoire choices. I was playing what seemed like perfectly normal fluty fare for someone who'd arrived at the con in year 11. At my previous school, I'd played quite a lot of Renaissance and Baroque music on the recorder. And so in year 11, I was just getting to know the AMEB's flute syllabus. But then Richard gave my Con High class a lecture, which changed everything. The lecture was in the small hall, for those of you who remember where and what that was. I seem to remember that Richard was wearing socks and sandals on that occasion. The socks and sandals didn't last too long. I definitely remember that he played us one of the Stockhausen Klavierstücke. I distinctly remember the Stockhausen, partly due to its shock value, but also because of Richard's hyper-enthusiasm for it and his understanding of the rationale behind the structure. I wasn't immediately won over, but eventually Richard's vast knowledge of new music did open up exciting horizons for me. New music was daring, experimental, creative, weird, wonderful, and positive. And it is open-ended, in that the repertoire is not finite, but it's being continuously added to. So I have been on a quest ever since then, really. A quest for new repertoire, a new means of expression on the flute. This quest was guided largely by Richard. We all know how generous he was with his scores and his renowned cassette dubs. He must have bought TDK cassettes in industrial quantities. Either that or the con did. I still have quite a lot of them at home, actually. He introduced me to the music of Donatoni, Barrett, Zimmerman, various Zimmermans, Michael Finnessy, James Dillon, and of course Brian Ferneyhough, amongst many others. His introduction to musicology course was legendary and was a wonderful preparation for a career focused mainly on contemporary music. After graduating from the con, I went to Europe with Richard's encouragement. I'd heard so much about the famous Darmstadt courses, or back then the infamous Darmstadt courses, that they were an obvious destination for me, and I got there in the mid-1980s. And from then onwards I started to collaborate with composers, most notably with Chris Dench. When we returned to Australia in 1990, I was eager to add to and document the evolving Australian flute repertoire, especially with my fellow graduates from the con, Michael Smetanin and Brophy. The most recent collaboration is the piece that I'm about to play, Backbone. Backbone grew out of Michael's opera of a few years ago called Mayakovsky. It's for flute and fixed media, which is treated pre-recorded flute sounds. This is our third collaboration, and a fourth is under discussion.
So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Michael, as well for that piece. Just want to make sure I've got the slides up again. If we can move now to Professor Richard Dunn, as I said, a friend of Richard's for a long time, but very particularly just recently. So.
Thank you. I'm going to read something out because otherwise I'll lose track. In our house, Richard Toop was always referred to with great affection simply as Toop, and I suspect we weren't the only ones. But there were many Toops with whom each of us here most likely enjoyed a very particular relationship, depending on context, and for me also there were many Toops. So I want to speak a little about my Toop with whom I had the privilege of sharing so much of the last 12 months in particular. And during this time I came to know the private Toop. I'm learning a little bit more about him this evening. Unknown to each other, we were in London around the same time in the late 60s, 70s. After studying art at the Royal College of Art in the late 60s, I worked for the Who and Richard for Stockhausen in Darmstadt. Richard had 4 Who CDs in his collection, which was about, I think, 0.08% of the collection. And I had the Helicopter Quartet, which is almost a coincidence. Richard dined frequently in our house and was always curious about my work and what was happening in the studio. At least he always questioned me and would draw out what was motivating thoughts, whether about Wittgenstein or Namatjira, me always trying to test his familiarity with popular music and popular culture. Traced through the Mississippi blues and connecting back to the beginnings of rock and roll. But he contributed to my collection a double CD of Robert Johnson and expanded my understanding of late 20th century music, new music. He attended my exhibitions and biennales with which Suzanne was involved. The amazing thing about Richard was how deep and broad was his knowledge. Always super articulate and completely at ease. Everything could be processed not from standard positions, but through his limitless and playful curiosity. And I think wonder is a word you used, which really encapsulates my sense of him. I asked him if he'd heard of a composer friend of mine in Paris, John Arrigo. A few days later, he delivered a CD. Richard Toop was very smart and also very amusing, often at the same time. Perhaps I should say he could be fairly easily amused. This made Richard so charming in the midst of very serious things. Perhaps it was this combination that made him so engaging, and most importantly, engaged with new things and hungry for news throughout his life. Richard was a musicologist and a computer gamer. Listening and reading were central. Music, of course, scores, mathematics, philosophy meshed together with his massive collection of CDs, many books and movie DVDs, which were the only things he kept in order. Richard was a collector and a cataloguer of information. For him, stream music was of no interest. It's of no use, he would say, that is, without the information elaborated on in the CD's liner notes. The quality of intelligent curiosity clearly preceded his time as Stockhausen's teaching assistant in Darmstadt and continued throughout his life, although it was probably reinforced by this important relationship, a relationship that continued to the end, with Karl-Heinz regularly sending Richard CDs affectionately illustrated with a heart and addressing him as Lieb Richard. I met Richard through my wife, Suzanne Davie, who worked at the Con for 6 years from 1989. And this was a time of transition for the Conservatorium into the university, and was for the Con, as for others, a very difficult period. It was Richard's once-a-week lunches, forbearance and friendship that helped Suzanne survive it. I was the director of Sydney College of the Arts, but didn't have a Richard to keep my spirits up. However, I invited him to give a talk at the college on the basis that, for me, there's no great distinction between the adventure of contemporary contemporary art and contemporary music, or Richard thinking out loud. There are aspects of the same impulse, or that the same underlying attitude to life can have many different outcomes. In any case, David Ahern, who used to quote John Cage saying, "I have nothing to say and I'm saying it," had been there at the beginning. Richard told me quite recently that for Cage, saying it was doing it. The penny dropped. Thanks, Richard. Obvious, really. Where these different things came together most obviously was with the engineer, mathematician, architect and composer Yanis Xenakis, and the composer, music theorist, writer, philosopher and artist John Cage. And it was such an open intellectual and creative impulse underlying a variety of outcomes that formed the basis for Richard and my relationship. And while rightly Richard's contribution to an understanding of new music and his elaboration of the idea of new complexity, his professional legacy, the personal attributes that lead to this are far more wide-ranging. For example, that Richard wasn't only listening to Stockhausen in the 60s, as demonstrated by his recommendation many years ago of Hendrix's Electric Ladyland and Robert Johnson as exemplary, and that fragment of his CD collection that included the Velvet Underground, Public Enemies, Cecil Taylor, post-60s new wave, punk, metal, jazz and soul. And also on the sidebar, our shared interest in Syd Barrett period Pink Floyd. We shared the pleasure of listening again to their first single, Arnold Lane, who had the strange hobby of purloining ladies' clothes. This in the midst of music that Richard wanted to listen to in his last months. Beethoven's late quartets, Rouleau's Plis Selon Plis, Chopin, played by Richard Woodward, of course, Nono, and Bach. This diversity of music, obviously overwhelmingly focused on new music in the second half of the 20th and early 21st centuries, had one characteristic in common. Constantly emphasised by Stockhausen, Klang, music as sound. And that idea that, while very critical and with strong opinions, Richard was without prejudice. I saw Richard most often during the last year, every couple of days, so there was more to discuss than was possible during the previous 30 years. Richard was insatiably curious and craved mental stimulation, and as a person who loved company, he loved seeing people. He was reading Heidegger, King James Bible, accessing his mathematics primers and rediscovering Peter Sloterdijk in German eventually. He wanted to practice his languages, particularly German, and was learning a little Nepalese on the off chance of communicating better with the nursing staff. I love my talks with Richard as he was open to anything and critically curious about everything, big and small. He wanted to know what people were doing. He wanted to know what was going on outside. That he could be so open and at his most vulnerable made these times together very special. And if things seemed to be a bit ridiculous, he could always drop into his Pete and Doug voice to comment on himself from a slight remove. Lieb Richard.
Thank you so much for that evocative talk there. So the last one of us to speak will be Richard's great friend, Diane Collins. Actually, I might go through some photos while that happens. These were taken by Anya Masovic and Stockhausen. I think this is probably the look that many of us will remember in the last few years at a lectern, characteristically with Samantha and granddaughter Isabel. And the last one I have is Richard and Isabel, and the look on his face absolutely typifies the way he talked about, well, you can't see it very well, but it's there. Okay, thank you, Diane.
I'm not a musician in any sense, but Richard Toop and I were colleagues and then close friends for nearly 30 years. I sat down to write these few rueful words on the 1st of this month, Richard's birthday. On previous August 1st, I marked the occasion with Richard at celebrating luncheons, or with a few, and then a few more drinks. I never expected to spend an August 1 reflecting on his death. So how to sum up a man as complex and indeed contradictory as R.T.? His virtues spring effortlessly to mind: exceptional intelligence, at times ferocious wit, great intellectual and personal generosity, a concern for principle and for truth. A large part of Richard's charm was, however, also located in eccentricity, in what I could call his oppositional construction of himself. His English origins might explain, for example, why he never acquired a survival skill like learning how to swim, but he also couldn't drive and never owned a house or virtually any material possessions beyond books, manuscripts and CDs, the furnishings that the life of the mind required. Richard's inability to drive, incidentally, made him one of the greatest benefactors of the Sydney taxi industry. With the partial exception of light rail, public transport was for other people. Richard's avoidance regimes also extended to disdaining vegetables, never voting, and never lodging an income tax return. That was until he received a please explain letter from the tax office. I sent him off to see my accountant, who later reflected that he had rarely had such fun constructing a return. And the end result, you guessed it, the tax office owed Richard money. Despite a possible surfeit of strongly held convictions, there was also a good deal of ambivalence in Richard's world. One of the obvious areas was in relation to his Englishness. While he enjoyed dismissing whole slabs of English culture, that wonderfully memorable voice and certain attitudes betrayed a man still tied to some aspects of his birthplace. I'm thinking here, for example, of his perspectives on class. Richard came from a middle-class family, and this gave him perhaps essentially unconscious English expectations in relation to background and achievement. I say this as a carpenter's daughter. I'll never forget his unease when I first informed him of my parentage. His whole body physically contracted. The conversation was shut down immediately, very unusual for Richard, and never raised again. That said, Richard resists pigeonholing in relation to the mental and the manual. One university holiday, he needed a job and landed one at Foyle's, London's vast bookshop. He immediately decided, however, that he neither liked the place nor the parsimonious pay rates. Recalling a nearby construction site, he got himself hired as a builder's labourer. The wages were much more generous, but he was also honest enough to recall that he really wasn't initially accepted by the other workers. Richard actually described this to me as his first ever experience of rejection. But he lasted the required weeks, and at the time he quit, his fellow workers had reversed their original assessment. Interestingly, on Richard's sense of identity in relation to nation, I asked him a few months before his death how he felt about being described in a recent work on new music as a, quote, Australian musicologist. Somewhat to my surprise, he replied he didn't mind at all. Reflecting on the less expected or overt aspects of Richard, it would be remiss not to mention his interest in sport. I was once part of a lunch conversation in which a number of us tried to recall the name of a rugby league player commonly referred to as Walker. Only Richard could come up with the answer, which was, incidentally, Steve Roach. But Richard was really not a genuine football fan. The game he loved was tennis. Richard eagerly anticipated major tournaments, had very strong opinions about the leading players, and was known to end phone conversations because he needed to go and watch Leighton Hewitt. This also betrays the fact that in his last decade of life, Richard acquired an item long absent, a television. His explanation of this was quintessentially Toopish. He said he did not own a television because if he did, he would watch it. But as his physical mobility declined, Richard saw merit in the purchase. A TV also fed another of Toop's passions, video gaming. Good Game was his favourite television program. Across last year, Richard also spent considerable time switching between Fox and CNN to follow the American presidential campaign. Such was his curiosity about the fate of the new president that Donald Trump's only virtue may be in providing Richard for some time and a reason to linger. All incentive vanished in a few weeks before his death. I frequently visited Richard across the past year when he was in hospital and then a nursing home. Even though totally bedridden, his engagement with ideas, events and people survived until about 2 weeks before the end, when Richard said to me on one visit that he was for the first time without hope. Then in the last week of his life, Richard also lost virtually all cognitive clarity. He was no longer the man we knew and loved, and in these terms, his death was genuinely a release. Richard was complicated. Though a wonderful and supportive friend, he judged himself as not good with relationships. His easy charm disguised, I think, more inner sadness than most of us suspected. From time to time, Richard reflected on the premature passing of the composer Don Banks. He would sum up his grief by saying that he could have done with a lot more than Don. That is what I and many others feel about the loss of you, dear Richard.
So we're joined by another of Richard's friends, the pianist Tonya Lemoh, for the last performance tonight. Tonya studied here. We sat in music history together, actually, but subsequently has had a distinguished career in Denmark and Europe and the States as a soloist. What would you like to play, Tonya, and why did you choose it for Richard's memorial?
Well, again, slightly roundabout explanation. My most treasured moments with Richard were just in the corridors of Pitt Street and in the lift, where he would thrust tapes at me and say, "Tonya, you've got to listen to this." And a lot of the time it was almost always romantic piano music, and especially late romantic piano music, and he would wax lyrical about the virtues of that particular performer, that particular interpretation. So even though I knew he was this, new music guru and one of the revered teachers and great intellects, to me, this kind of unabashed romanticism and enthusiasm for the joys of piano playing, and it was something that was so contagious. And at the same time, I must say, he was one of the real bridges between those who came into the con as sort of the performer who, just thought about the piano all the time. Speaking for myself, that was what I came for, and all the academic things. I was like, oh God, do we have to do this, and do we have to do that, and oh no, it's counterpoint, and no, it's early music. But actually, Richard was one of the people who really opened up the life of the mind and the importance of that side of music, and somehow welded the two worlds together so that there weren't the same divisions anymore. And I think a lot of the performance students felt that way, and he really stimulated that other side, and at the same time had a genuine passion for playing and for the bones and blood of the music. And I must also add on the personal level that we also had a few drinks usually with Rachel after concerts and at dinners and birthdays, and he was great. And one of the things I really liked about him was, yes, he seemed to know pretty much everything, but he never made you feel stupid. He really lauded curiosity, and he welcomed it and was excited by it, and he would always give you the time of day, want to answer your question, think about it, and you'd sort of feel humbled by the amount of and the quality of the information you got without feeling belittled yourself as not knowing before, just enriched. And this is such a wonderful gift, I think. So anyway, the pieces that I chose, the piece I've chosen, Bach Busoni. Busoni was a real titan of the turn of the century, and I think Richard was a bit of a titan as well in his own way. So that's sheer sort of grandeur of the person. Bach Busoni immediately came to mind when Rachel asked me to play this. I think often with pieces, you know, the piece comes to mind and then why sort of drips in later. And Busoni was this massive figure. He wrote about aesthetics in music. He was a real thinker and very engaged with the music public and with people, and as well as being a fabulous pianist and a composer. And Bach, I think, Damien, you're the one who said rigour was an aspect of Richard. I think that rigorous intellect and the sort of beauty of the purity of his mind when he was really honing in on something. Bach, for me, that kind of absolute perfection and balance also was an aspect of Richard. So, and Busoni's transcriptions. I chose the transcription because I got a lot of transcriptions from Richard, notably Godowski's Chopin etudes, which are basically unplayable, and he just enjoyed that fact so much, and dissecting the performances and stuff. But the art of transcription, to me, is really about illumination of the essence of the original piece. And I think Busoni captures the essence of Bach. The spiritual sort of luminosity of Bach comes through, and at the same time there's this very strong personal, human voice that is experiencing it and transforming it, presenting it to us, the listener. The transcriber does that. And for me, Richard was really somebody who illuminated for us, for everybody in different ways, and still had his own very special twist on everything. And I think he's just given us such a present in his life. So, yeah, that's why I chose that piece. And now I'll play it.
last section, we would really love to hear from you. I'm sure there are sides to Richard that have definitely not been explored and that other people will have interesting experiences. Adam, can I just get those slides back beforehand? Just before we do that, Suzanne is going to go around with a microphone. Right, I just want to put up a celebration of Richard is not a good idea without a few drinks, and we would like to continue to toast him we've found a venue quite close by down at the Quay, and Diane has arranged for them to have a room under the name of Collins. So if anyone wants to join us for drinks, they also have a kitchen that's open as well. So would anyone like to share a memory or a tribute? Elena, Suzanne will come over with a microphone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Elena Kats-Chernin, hello. I just want to say how lucky I was, and I heard that said from every one of you, and my life definitely would have been very different. I remember I wrote this very imaginatively titled piece, Study of Arithmetics. And I thought I was terribly inventive, and I wrote a piece for oboe, piano, and mouth organ, which I played at the same time as piano. It was played in a concert practice, and it was in the Joseph Post Auditorium in the old building. And a gentleman, beautifully dressed, came up to me and said, I hear you looking for a composition teacher, because I was. And he said, I'll teach you. And I was excited beyond excitement, because we knew who he was, because he just arrived in Australia. I actually had just arrived in Australia myself from Russia. I never heard of Stockhausen. I never heard of anything. I never heard of Second Viennese School. I didn't know anything because it was forbidden in my time. I came here in 1975, the same year as Richard. And he taught me everything I knew. I had those luxurious lessons which lasted for hours, involved lunch and dinner, and lots of drink. I learned to drink this way, actually. And what was so wonderful about Richard is the generosity with which he was not only shared the knowledge, but he shared the excitement about the pieces. And whenever I was about to, I said, I want to write a piece for piano and metronome. He says, well, somebody has done that already. And he would play something to you which was something similar. And he would play not one, but 5 pieces of the same sort. And then he said, well, try this. Why don't you do this exercise? And he would be disappointed if you don't bring him 10 pages of something. He really genuinely wanted you to please him with many pages. When it was 1979, and I studied with him quite a long time, and I saw Michael Smetanin and Jerry Brophy come into being in the school and study at the same time with me. It was a very exciting time. In 1979, he said to me, he sat me down, and he said, it's time for you to go overseas. And I was heartbroken. I said, Richard, you don't want me anymore as your student. I could study with you forever. I can't imagine anyone else teaching me. And he said, I'm a musicologist. You should study with a composer. It's very important to... And I thought he was already in composition's mind. He was in composer's mind himself. So he sat me down, and for about, I remember it was about 8 hours, he made me listen to a lot of composers. He said, who do you like? Do you like this, 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 this? He played Donatoni, Barrett, of course, everybody. But the pieces that stood out for me were by Henri Pissot, by Ferneyhough, and by Lachenmann. And after this, he wrote letters on my behalf to all those people. And he asked them to look at my pieces. They all accepted me. In the end, he wrote applications for the scholarship, DAD, I don't know if people may know what that is, German Exchange Scholarship. He actually wrote all this, because I was hopeless with forms. You say he was impractical. I was more so. I couldn't drive either. And he basically made it happen that I was accepted by Lachenmann. I still have that typed letter where he says, your teacher Richard Toop spoke on your behalf. And then later, and I will keep it very short, later he actually introduced me to Laura Chislett. He said, you have to meet, he kept doing this to everyone, you have to meet that and that and that person. And he said, Laura, I should bring you together and you should do something together. And so that was when I came back to Sydney, my first commission ever was from Sydney Alpha Ensemble, because I met Laura through Richard Toop. And the story can go forever, but I don't want to take too much time. It's just, we lost somebody, so in a way, he was an angel. I think he was an angel, so I
don't think he self-identified as an angel, but yes.
I say so. Thank you.
I think you're right. Thank you,
you.
that was amazing. Thank you, that was so great to hear. Who else? Anyone else? A story? Sharon.
I won't say very much at all, except I really need to say, of course, I'm blessed to have known him. The coruscating intellect was white hot at all times. He was loved language so much. When you talk to him, it was never, you talk about Walter Benjamin, no. It has to be Walter Benjamin. You couldn't say Xenakis, it had to be Xenakis. It wasn't because of pomposity or pretentiousness, it was because he loved it, and he loved the sound, and he loved the language, and he gave a lot to me, and thank him so much.
Thanks, Sharon. So, Rick, down the front. Suzanne, thanks. Right down the front. Right down the front. Suzanne's now tutoring in music history too, so it's very appropriate she's contributing.
I've moved to Sydney from Melbourne to study composition, initially with Don Banks, who I didn't get to study with. In my, I think, second year, I was Don's student, but by that stage, because of his worsening illness and circumstances, I hardly ever saw him. So I met Richard, and immediately all of us, bonded with, incredibly long afternoons of cooking and drinking and going through scores and taking things home. And so really I eventually withdrew from the course, but he was my de facto one and only really teacher who shaped pretty much the rest of my musical life. In fact, when I eventually studied in Rome with Donatoni, I was very sort of hesitant and showing him scores, progress on things I was working on. And he just as apologetically, Donatoni would say, well, what are you doing here? You don't really need me. You've had such a good teacher.
Wow.
That just, hang around. We'll talk about whatever you like, have a cigar or coffee, talk about women, talk about music. But there's not a lot I can show you. Anyway, so that was the upbeat to the last time I saw Richard was about here in Sydney, probably about a year and a half ago. Very guilty, I hadn't seen him in a long time. And I went to his place, we met, and had dinner at a little Italian restaurant nearby. And it was a nice Sydney, balmy sort of night. And while having dinner, I said, look, I want to thank you for everything. He thought that was pointless, like, what for? I said, look, you are the greatest musician the greatest mind and the greatest musician I've ever encountered in my life. And I've met all sorts of people. And I just want to thank you again. Out of the blue, really, I'm not in the scene. I don't really compose anymore. Well, we both had a good little cry. He wept for half of the meal, kind of, and it was lovely. We had more drinks, more food, and that was a lovely evening, and I walked him home. That's the last time I saw him.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for telling us that. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything, or shall we continue this over drinks? Okay, drinks it is. I just want to finish up by thanking Guy McEwen, Felicity Nibbs, Jared Salmon, Lee Edwards, Samantha Lestival, and Adam, who's not there anymore. Oh, yes, you are. For doing all this amazing technical stuff this evening. We're going to finish, as we walk out, we wanted some music to be played, and Richard was a Renaissance man in a whole bunch of ways, but his love of Renaissance counterpoint was something, scurrilous songs by Janikin, of course, but very much Lassus, I think, was one of his main composers. So we're playing Timor et Tremens and Prophetae Sibilarum as we leave. So hopefully see some of you down at the bar.